Hello everyone, Sigourney Weaver here. I hope you're all having a fabulous night. So sorry I can't be with you live, although over Zoom you probably wouldn't know the difference anyway, but just pretend I'm there because I wish I were. In any case, you have my good friends James Cameron, Jon Landau, and Stephen Lang with you, so you're in really good hands. I'm here tonight to introduce you to my good friend Lucy Lang. Lucy's a native New Yorker and such an inspiring female leader. She's running to bring real change to our criminal justice system as the next Manhattan District Attorney. Lucy's devoted her life to the community and to changing the system from inside and out, both as a former district attorney and as a criminal justice reform leader at John Jay College. Lucy recognizes that the role of district attorney is about much more than just prosecution. Keeping our cities safe means creating a justice system that works for everyone in our diverse communities. And that means that we need a district attorney with the experience and the vision to turn ideas into transformational change. Here's what I like most about Lucy. Lucy doesn't just listen. She really hears people. Her campaign is driven by the people who actually be affected by the decisions the district attorney makes, from victims and survivors to incarcerated people, their families, and the communities that they call home. There is just a world of difference between how Lucy approaches this work and how everyone else does. Let me give you an example of what that looks like in action. In 2017, Lucy created a first-of-its-kind, semester-long college-in-prison program that for the very first time brought prosecutors into prisons to study alongside incarcerated people so the prosecutors could better understand and learn from the people who are actually impacted by the justice system. That program is now a gold standard that's being replicated all across the country. This is the kind of personal, transformational leadership that Lucy will bring to the DA's office. And the sooner the better. I think we can all agree on that.
Good evening, and welcome to this conversation with Lucy Lang. My name is Stephen Lang, and I'm the candidate's father. I'd like to preface the hour by quoting the great Speaker of the House, Tip O'Neill, who wisely and rightly advised us all that all politics is local. It's as true today as it was 50 years ago, perhaps even truer, because tonight we are all of us Georgians. You know, just the other day I had a chance to preview the wonderful video message that Sigourney recorded. And I was delighted, and I emailed her right away to express my appreciation, my gratitude for it. And she emailed me back and she wrote the following words. She said, "Everything I said about Lucy is true, and what a rare pleasure that is. Lucy will bring transformational change to our battered and beloved city, and we are so lucky to have your brilliant, wise, and compassionate daughter running for DA." Thank you, Sig. We all feel so fortunate to have you as a close friend and as a mentor, as a revered New Yorker, as an actor who has achieved legendary status for performance after performance of strong, empowered, courageous, and compassionate women. Your words about Lucy makes me realize that perhaps it is true that it takes one to know one. Now, a number of Sigourney's legendary performances have come to life through the films of another friend, a legend in his own right. James Cameron has been blazing trails in cinema for over 40 years. As writer, producer, and director, he has created such classics as The Terminator, Aliens, The Abyss, T2, True Lives, Titanic, and of course, Avatar. And in so doing, Jim has been the leader in creating some of the truly iconic women in the history of cinema. Sarah Connor, Rose Dawson, Helen Tasker, Grace Augustine, Ripley, and Neytiri, each a warrior second to none. Quite apart from, but deeply informing Jim's work in cinema are his well-earned credentials as environmentalist, activist, engineer, inventor, scientist, explorer, and sustainable agribusinessman and farmer. Jim Cameron has consistently been ranked for many years as one of the 100 most influential people in the world. And I know him as the most supportive, the most challenging, the most demanding, which is to say, the absolute finest director any actor could ever wish for. And I am privileged to call him my friend. I'd like to introduce to you James Cameron. Kia ora, Jim.
Well, thanks, Lang, for those extremely kind words. I think it's safe to say that you've cemented your place in the cast of Avatar 4 and 5. And thanks to all of you for being here to celebrate with us a new year, a new administration, a brighter future, and the promise of overdue reforms to the American criminal justice system. I'm sure you know the United States incarcerates more people than any other country in history, with more than 2 million people behind bars. And a hugely disproportionate percentage of them are people of color. This summer's protests after George Floyd's murder have brought long overdue attention to racial injustice nationally. And across the country, prosecutors are being elected on platforms that seek to address these problems. And this evening, we will hear from one such candidate, Lucy Lang, who's running for a Manhattan District Attorney. Now, 73% of the 2,400 elected district attorneys across the country are white males, and Manhattan has never had a female DA. And I personally think Lucy's leadership is long overdue. So now I want to introduce you to Lucy, who will be having a conversation about her vision for the future of criminal justice with my friend and my producing partner, Jon Landau. Jon was born in New York City. He's an Oscar-winning producer. He's best known around the world for producing our blockbuster hits Titanic and Avatar. And Jon and I are currently working on Avatar 2 and 3, and we look forward to continuing our partnership through Avatar 4 and 5 and many other projects beyond that. Jon is a recognized leader in the movie business, including making our films the best examples of sustainable green production in the industry. And in addition, Jon was at the forefront of getting our industry back to work during the COVID crisis by assembling a medical advisory group to develop safe working procedures for our cast and crew. And he's also set very high standards for diversity and equality and an abuse-free working environment for everyone on our productions. Lucy Lang is a highly experienced and progressive candidate for Manhattan District Attorney, who has recently been endorsed by brave silence breakers and survivors of Harvey Weinstein's sexual abuse, and by mothers who lost loved ones to police violence. Lucy most recently served as director of the Institute for Innovation in Prosecution, a national criminal justice reform nonprofit. Lucy previously served as an assistant district attorney in Manhattan, where she investigated and prosecuted homicides, domestic violence, and gun crimes, and created a college and prison course to develop innovative criminal justice policy. She spent the past 3 years teaching that class in New York State prisons, and Sigourney briefed you on that a little bit as well. Lucy is the eldest daughter of my colleague and friend Stephen Lang, we call him Slang, who plays the role of Colonel Quaritch in Avatar and its sequels. I'm certain that Lucy will display the same tenacity and commitment as Manhattan DA that her dad, Slang, does in our work together, and New Yorkers will be in very capable hands. It's my pleasure to introduce both Jon and Lucy for a discussion on New York City and the future of criminal justice. Take it away, guys.
Thank you very much, Jim. And thank you, Stephen. It's a pleasure to be here with everybody tonight. When I go around the world and people meet me and they quickly go, "You're from New York, aren't you?" I take that with great pride. So to be a part of this tonight gives me great pride. Lucy, I want to start with a very, very basic question. What does a DA do, and why should people care about who their DA is?
I'm really glad that you asked, because it's nothing to be embarrassed about that most people simply don't know what a district attorney does. And it's a uniquely American phenomenon that we elect our district attorneys. So the United States is the only country in the world where the chief local law enforcement officer answers directly to us, the public. And it dates back to the earliest days of the American Republic that prosecutors are vested with tremendous discretion in deciding what laws to enforce and how to enforce them. So that means everything from what to do when someone jumps the turnstile in the subway, to what to do when someone is shot and killed, to large-scale bank fraud. And all of that falls under the jurisdiction of the local DA. So people should care, because they should care what happens to folks who are experiencing homelessness, who've traditionally been wrapped up in the criminal justice system. They should care because when they are victimized, they should care about how that office is positioned to respond to their victimization. And increasingly, it's incredibly exciting to see Americans starting to pay attention to the incredible impact that district attorneys can have on standards of safety, equity, and dignity in our communities.
Well, that certainly helps clarify it for me anyway. Every time we've spoken, I've been struck by your telling of stories. You're telling of stories about people, because that's something we do in the film industry. We make movies to tell stories about people. So I want to ask you, what story has stayed with you about people from your years as the assistant district attorney?
I do think that it is the love of stories that I have had since childhood, thanks in large part to my dad and my mom and their commitment to the arts, that has led me down this path. A story that really has stayed with me is from when I was a very junior lawyer at the district attorney's office handling misdemeanor cases, so low-level cases. And a case came in which a neighbor had called the police because they heard a ruckus in an apartment. And when the police responded, they arrested a man and his wife because the man had broken a light bulb with a broomstick and she had pushed him. So they arrested both of them and brought them down on misdemeanor complaints. Over the course of many, many months, I developed a relationship with the woman and came to learn that, in fact, she had been the victim of terrible and ongoing abuse for more than 8 years at the hands of her live-in partner. And that he would do everything from wait for her outside of her employment and garnish her wages, to brutally beat her underneath her clothes so that her employers wouldn't see, to keep her locked inside the apartment for weeks on end. And she had been afraid to report it because of the fact that she was undocumented, and was afraid that if she called the police or if she went to the district attorney, that she would face deportation. So I met with her in her own neighborhood, near her employment, wherever worked for her. I sought support from clinicians and social workers. I worked to ensure that she was able to secure what's known as a U visa that supports people who are victims of crimes, to ensure that they're not deported. And ultimately, she testified in the grand jury, and the case proceeded against her abuser, and the relationship ended. We stayed in touch over the years, and she called me several years later to say that she'd moved to the Bronx, and she wanted to tell me that unfortunately she had gotten in another abusive relationship, but that this time she had had the courage to call the police herself and to go to the district attorney's office, because she knew that she would be taken care of and the abusive situation would end. She called me again several years later to tell me that her daughter had just had a child. And she wanted me to know that her daughter had selected the name Lucy for her child because she felt that, but for the intervention of the district attorney's office and our work together, her mother wouldn't have been around to meet her granddaughter. And to me, I hold that woman's powerful story as the potential, part of the potential of what the Office of the District Attorney can do to support people who are victimized in our communities.
Well, you mentioned, what the district attorney's office can do. I know that the office can't create law, but it certainly can affect public policy. And I'm wondering, specifically around racial justice and mass incarceration, which are two big issues in New York. How can the DA affect public policy around those two issues?
I'm committed to a district attorney's office that takes solving mass incarceration in our lifetime as an express goal. And that is something that we can and must do if I have learned anything from the incarcerated New Yorkers whom I have worked with. But it requires everything from declining to prosecute cases that don't belong in the criminal justice system. That means things like marijuana smoking. And it means diverting cases out of the criminal justice system that belong in other systems. Mental health challenges, substance misuse, poverty, none of those things should be treated by the criminal justice system, although for a generation we have been. And all of those kinds of prosecutions have contributed to the overcriminalization of communities of color in New York City and elsewhere. So part of the racial justice strategy is really shrinking the criminal justice footprint to focus on what really hurts communities.
And that in turn has the impact on the mass incarceration and everything like that. Right. This year has sort of been an unprecedented attention on policing. What role can the DAs do to respond to the call for police reform and police accountability?
As Jim mentioned, I have been endorsed by families who lost loved ones to police violence, including names that will be sadly very familiar to listeners, including Valerie Bell, Sean Bell's mother, Victoria Davis, Delron Small's sister, and Valerie Castile, Philando Castile's mother. And that's based on several years worth of work that I did alongside these women to develop protocols for how prosecutors can ensure that police are held accountable for misconduct and brutality. Because of course, prosecutors work with police because the police very often bring cases into the district attorney's office. But the district attorney's mandate is to serve the entire community. And that includes making sure that when police commit crimes, they're held accountable.
Okay, now, but another thing that I'm not 100% clear on, I think a lot of people are confused at, is the term about defunding the police. So, in terms of defunding the police, what does that mean to and for DAs?
There's tremendous focus now on how resources are being spent, and I think that is very much to the good. John, for the past decade, there has been this term in criminal justice academia called justice reinvestment, which essentially means taking money out of punitive responses to criminal conduct and putting it into pro-social supportive services. And that is very hard to argue with. But of course, that term didn't catch on until people started calling for defunding the police. And that can mean a whole range of things. But I think that many of us can agree that we have spent far too much as a country keeping people behind bars, punishing people, and undermining the health of communities. And if we figure out ways to take those resources and invest them into communities, into prevention, into healing, we will all be better off and safer for it.
So that was something I was going to get to a little bit later, but I want to delve a little bit deeper into it, which is this idea of restorative justice. Because again, it's a term that's relatively new, to me. So would you mind maybe a little bit more detail and explain your thoughts about it and the impact it could have? Because what I've been reading about, it can really have a tremendous impact on so many different aspects of the community.
Absolutely. Restorative justice is actually an ancient practice that dates back to indigenous peoples and peacemaking circles. But when we talk about it now, it refers to bringing people together with community when harm has occurred and working together towards a resolution. And it can take different forms, and it is not appropriate in every case. There are certain kinds of cases where people will be re-victimized, for example, by facing the person who had hurt them. And there are certain cases where people simply aren't ready or don't want to sit down with someone who has hurt them, or the person who committed the injury isn't in a position to do that. But in some cases, it is an appropriate tool in the criminal justice system. And I had a really profound experience witnessing one such case myself. There was a case a couple of years ago on the Upper West Side on Broadway, where a beloved Lehman College professor was going to an ATM machine. And on his way out, a man who was down on his luck grabbed the money from the professor's hand and pushed the professor down, who hit his head and died. The man who had robbed him was charged with felony murder, which carried a 20 to life sentence. He had never been arrested before. And during the course of the prosecution, it became clear that the son of the professor was very concerned about the man who had committed the crime and kept asking questions about what the conditions were like at Rikers, what the outcome was going to be, and that he felt very unresolved about it. And so the prosecutor handling the case, who incidentally was a student, had been a student in my college and prison class, which I'd love to talk more about, where we study restorative justice, she thought that this might be an appropriate case for restorative justice. And so she brought in a facilitator, a trained expert with clinical expertise, to meet with both the man who'd committed the crime and the son of the victim. And they met repeatedly over a lot of time. And ultimately, both parties felt that they wanted to meet one another. I then had the incredible good fortune to sit on one side of a one-way mirror and watch for several hours while the son of the man who'd been killed and the man who killed his father sat together and talked about what had happened. The man who lost his father was able to talk about the book his father would now never be able to write. The man who committed the crime was able to talk about the feeling of desperation that led him to commit the robbery that day. And at the end, they embraced. And I have witnessed many families who have lost loved ones to murder. And I have never seen the kind of resolution that the son experienced in that case. So it really does hold tremendous promise as a tool for responding to many kinds of crime, including some crimes of violence.
That's a powerful story you told. Jim, I heard Jim mention, and something I knew about, but I hadn't really thought about, is you teaching in the prisons. And I'm curious. It got me thinking. What insights on the justice system did you gain from that experience of actually teaching, in the prisons?
Well, I'll start by telling you what brought me to the idea of teaching the course, which is that I was investigating a case in which 5 people were shot and 1 killed in Upper Manhattan. I'm pointing as though you can see that I'm pointing towards Upper Manhattan. And I became close to the mother of the young man who'd been killed, who himself had a 3-year-old child. And over the course of many, many months, we worked together. We were together during the course of the trial. And I called her the day after the guilty verdict and asked her how she felt. And she said, I slept all night for the first time since my son was murdered. But when I woke up, all I could think about were the mothers of those 2 boys, referring to the 2 men who had just been convicted of murdering her son. And it illuminated for me the blinders that the system creates for the people who operate it. And so I thought about the best way I know to try to get past that, which is sitting around a table and talking. So I created a first of its kind college and prison program to bring assistant district attorneys inside prisons to study and work alongside incarcerated community members and together develop ideas for change. Some of the insights that I have gleaned from that are that it is not that hard for people to connect past difference when they're put in that kind of setting. That the people closest to the problem often are the best at identifying solutions. And it has really highlighted for me the incredible deficiencies in our system in supporting people who are coming home from prison. Because one of the prisons that I've taught in is a reentry facility that many New Yorkers go to on their way back to New York City from upstate sentences. And I have stayed close to my students when they've come home, and I have seen time and time again that they are not given supportive services, they are barred from housing, they are challenged to find employment, and far too often find themselves back in the system.
Wow. One of the things is, it's one thing to be the criminal or the convicted. It's another thing to deal with the victims or the survivors. And, I often, think about, survivors of, sex crimes. And, I'm curious what are your plans for addressing sex crimes and also helping the survivors, of those horrific situations?
I approach that question the same way I will approach everything as district attorney, which is by going to the people who know it best. And in this case, that is survivors. So in working with survivors of abuse by Harvey Weinstein and other sexual abusers over time, I came to see the ways in which the system was simply not listening to people who were suffering and often re-traumatizing them, failing to provide them with adequate supports, and leaving folks without the justice that they so deserve. One example of this that I wouldn't have known but for the fact that I became close to a survivor is that there is no definition in the law for the word consent. And so in the Bill Cosby trial, in the Weinstein trial, jurors were told when they asked the judge, what does consent mean? Which of course is at the crux of so many of these cases. They were told to use their common sense. And when I spoke to survivors, they illuminated for me exactly how problematic this is. And that if we were to define consent as knowledgeable, freely given, and informed agreement, that we would be in a far different place than putting the onus on victims in the way that we do now.
Okay. New York is a very, very diverse, having grown up there, I know this, very, very diverse city. It's very racially diverse, but I also believe that it is now home to more LGBTQ plus people than any other city in the country. What can the DA do to support this important sector of the community?
Such an important question. And I have spent a lot of time on the campaign and leading up to the campaign, talking to community members and advocates to try to better understand the failings of the system for LGBTQ plus community members. Because you're right, we are home to the largest LGBTQ plus population of any city in the world, and that is part of our vibrancy as a city. So some of the things that I propose to respond to the unique needs of LGBTQ plus community members are developing an office that is accessible and responsive, developing an office that does outreach to those community groups, that seeks to build trust and ensure people that they will be heard and listened to and credited when they report crimes. I also know that there is a strong feeling amongst some community members that the lack of police accountability, the culture around policing undermines the feeling of health and wellness in LGBTQ plus communities. And so a big part of that is training around police and cultural humility to law enforcement in terms of how people are spoken to and approached in the street. It also means that crimes, hate crimes against LGBTQ plus community members have to be taken incredibly seriously. But at the same time, we need to look at the ways in which some laws enforcement have undermined those communities, including advocating for the repeal of the Walking While Trans bill that has been used to scoop up countless LGBTQ plus community members, in particular Black trans women. And this has been the deadliest year on record, last year, the deadliest year on record for Black trans women in this country. So that should be very much of concern. I also believe that we should and must decriminalize consensual sex between adults, and that the excessive criminalization of sexuality has undermined the health of LGBTQ plus community members. And finally, I think there's real room to expand restorative justice as part of the office's philosophy writ large, but in particular, how it responds to and better supports diverse community members.
In reading some recent articles, I noticed that the current district attorney, Vance, he's been scrutinized for some what I'd call high-profile leniency. And I think that's a very important topic today when we want to talk about social justice for people at different positions and stature in the community. What are your thoughts about that?
From the day that I launched this campaign, I had a policy published that explains that there will be no special access for anyone under my administration as district attorney. in any number of high-profile cases. There have been backroom meetings between senior members of district attorneys' staff and well-heeled attorneys. And regardless of what happens in those meetings, the fact that they happen undermines the public's confidence in the system. And the fact that public defenders don't have the same access to senior staff undermines the equity with which justice is administered. So I am committed to an office that treats everyone the same, regardless of who they are or who their attorney is, in terms of access to the levers of power and decision-making.
Okay. Now, one of the things that the next Manhattan DA in particular is going to be faced with is overseeing the current investigation into President Trump's taxes and other related matters. Do you think that case should be pursued?
That investigation, as I understand it, is under grand jury seal and is not public. And I certainly would never comment on an investigation that I don't know anything about. I also think that the worst possible thing that could happen would be for the next Manhattan district attorney to say something during a campaign that would suggest any kind of political motivation in making an assessment about pending cases. What I will say is that I do not believe that immunity from criminal liability is a consolation prize to losing an election. So I will pursue all the cases before the office with the utmost fairness and be apolitical in pursuing them, but certainly do not believe that former presidents should be immune from state law.
I would agree with that. One of the crises that is, facing New York and has been for, quite some time, I believe, is the homelessness. What can the DA do to address that in the city?
This is a shining example of the city's failures around homelessness in general, what has happened in the pandemic. We are in a moment where there are 1 million New Yorkers out of work, and there's an increase in street homelessness, as anyone would expect. And the criminal justice system for far too long has been a backstop for catching those cases, which it should never have been. And now people are being dropped into shelters without adequate supportive services. So in my plan to address homelessness, I intend to collaborate with other agencies who are better situated to respond to mental health and substance misuse and other drivers of homelessness, and invest resources in wraparound services and supportive shelters rather than simply shelter beds. And ultimately, building a New York that takes a housing first approach to handling homelessness, instead of permitting people to cycle through Rikers Island or to cycle through shelter beds.
Another thing that has only been exacerbated really by the pandemic in New York has been gun violence. Again, you're restricted as a DA by the laws, but what can the DA do to address a rise in gun violence that New York has seen this past year?
Heartbreakingly, we have seen the worst gun violence over the past year that we've seen in 14 years after tremendous strides had been made. So I have a plan to build a fast-track gun court that will divert all gun cases to a trauma-informed judge and attorneys who look to root causes of gun violence and seek to address the root causes to prevent the cyclical nature of gun violence, rather than relying on mandatory minimums and 3 strikes laws and other draconian means of responding punitively, solely punitively to gun violence. But as the only person actually in the campaign who has responded repeatedly to scenes of street gun violence, I am hyper aware of what a tragic effect every individual instance of gun violence has on the community. And I believe that it must be an absolute utmost priority of the next district attorney.
Another thing that has been a priority, in New York and the state, around the country this past year, has been COVID. And, I've also seen stories, though, of people taking advantage and trying to, defraud people, in this horrific time of COVID. Is there a role the DA can take in responding to people who are taking advantage of COVID in a negative fashion, on people?
It is so disheartening to see the increase in scams and fraudulent behavior, especially that target senior New Yorkers and vulnerable populations like immigrants around the COVID crisis. We are seeing people peddling fake inoculations, peddling fake medications, using the promise of medications to acquire people's identifying information and committing identity theft. And so I have committed to building a COVID-19 task force that would undertake an analysis of all of those cases, that would seek to create an environment in which, in particular, vulnerable and victimized New Yorkers are comfortable reporting their victimization, and that will address those cases once I take office.
When you were talking about the task force, that got me, thinking about how many lawyers are in the Manhattan DA's office, and how do you make sure that those are lawyers who have the same values that you're espousing here, in this interview?
I'm glad that you asked, because I should have started by saying that most people think that it is a job like being a legislator. And as you said, it's not a job about making the laws, it's a job about enforcing them. And it really is a job about running a huge production. There are nearly 500 lawyers in the Manhattan District Attorney's Office. There are 800 non-legal staff. And having served there for so much of my career, I know the ins and outs of that office. I know the ins and outs of the court system and the related agencies, and where the levers are that change needs to be made. One really core thing is, and this is aligned, I think, with a lot of the work that you have done in your industry, is recruiting and retaining a mission-aligned, diverse workforce. And that means, in my instance, recruiting from historically Black colleges and law schools. And it means creating affinity groups internally to help support people and make sure that all groups who are represented in the office feel supported and are able to excel professionally while there. But also with an eye towards building a district attorney's office that reflects the diversity of the city we live in, which sadly it never has before.
Okay. Now, we're hearing your point of view tonight, but I think there are, I don't know, a total of 9 candidates running. Are there any plans for debates? I think I value debates more than a lot of America, but I do find them insightful, and I'm wondering, are there any plans for debates amongst the candidates?
Well, you're in luck, John, because there actually is a debate tonight at 7 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, which I will be hopping on shortly. There have been a couple so far. There are 8 people in the race to date, and there's another debate tomorrow night. There's another debate next week. The way that it seems to be working is in a very localized way. So local Democratic clubs are bringing together the candidates so that their members can ask questions of the candidates. But most of them, because of the unique nature of this moment in time, are on Zoom and Facebook, so anyone can listen in. Of course, there are problems with that format as well. It can be difficult to get a really rigorous back and forth going in a debate of 8 people by Zoom, but we're doing our best.
So the way to watch the debate is through Facebook, or is there?
So folks can email my campaign, info@votelucylang.com, and we're happy to send along all the links. And most of them I post on my social media as well.
All right, and for those of us who might not be able to watch the debate tonight, as we said, there are quite a few candidates running for the DA position. Without being negative to any of the other candidates, what would you say differentiates you from your opponents?
I am the only candidate in the race who has worked to reform the system from inside and from outside. I have a unique perspective that is informed by everyone who touches the system, based on my work closely with victims of the most heinous violent crimes, and on my work with incarcerated people who have been re-traumatized by the system by dint of crimes that they committed, in some cases many years ago. So what I bring to this is a 360-degree view of the system and everyone it touches: crime victims, incarcerated people, and the families and communities we all call home.
And if you are to win the DA role, which I believe you will, at the end of your tenure, what metrics would you want someone to use to evaluate the job that you did?
Well, I'll start by saying that as soon as I take office, I will undertake a version of what has started to happen in Chicago, and I expect will start to happen in other cities, which is simply publishing data about what cases are being handled and how they're being treated, and then making it cross-referenceable with demographic data so that the public can actually go on the DA's website and assess where there are racial disparities. Are there racial disparities in robberies? Are there racial disparities about whose cases are being indicted or about what the outcomes are? So I will start by publishing data so that I can be held accountable from day one. But ultimately, the success of a district attorney doesn't turn on recidivism rates and who comes back into the system, although that does reflect a failure for district attorneys. And I think that the fact that we have seen so much cycling through the system over and over again over the past generation reflects the ways in which the system has failed. What really will measure the success of the district attorney are pro-social measurements. How many people who go through the system as victims or as people charged with crimes are ultimately able to secure stable jobs, find stable housing, be reunited with their children, complete their education, have positive health outcomes. And these are the kinds of things that we should really be factoring in assessing whether or not this system is working. And it requires a holistic view that brings to bear not just legal expertise, but the perspectives of clinicians, social workers, and everyone the system touches.
Well, thank you for answering all of those questions. But we met, probably close to 15 years ago through the film industry. So I want to turn my last question sort of to a two-part question that focuses back on our industry. And during that time, I've gotten to know not just you, but your family. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to say that, for me, there's nothing more important than family. And I have seen the family that you have in the greatest sense of it, from your parents to your siblings to your family itself. And it's really so great to see a family like yours. So I salute you, for that. But my question, going back to the films, and I'm turning it back to that side of things, and Jim talked about, and your dad talked about the women in our movies, Jim and my movies. And I'm curious, who is your favorite female character in our movies? And of our movies, which is your favorite movie?
Oh, well, John, you really saved the zinger for last, huh? I think I'm going to constrain myself to movies that you have both made together, because if we were to bring in Dick Tracy and the Terminator, it would be a whole other question that we'd have to litigate all night, perhaps. But my favorite female character from one of your films it is very hard to choose between Titanic's Rose and Neytiri, but I think that I will have to end where we began with Dr. Grace Augustine. And who other than scientists can we turn to in a moment of crisis like this than to help serve as guidance for the next generation? And of course, my favorite movie, and I'm not just saying this, my favorite movie probably of all time, but certainly that you all have made to date is Avatar. But I am willing to rescind that if 2, 3, 4, and 5 are superior.
My hope is that you will rescind that. And it also reminded me, when you were talking about some of the earlier movies, that I had the good fortune of working with your father years and years ago on a movie called Manhunter. So that goes way, way back. But Lucy, I want to thank you for running. I don't think enough people step up for civic responsibility, and I could truly think of no one better for this position than yourself. And at this moment, I'd like to turn it back to my good friend, Stephen Lang.
Thank you so much, John.
Hello again. Well, I think that the conversation over the past hour has highlighted the vital importance of the office of Manhattan District Attorney. And I think that we've been given a strong and a clear indication of Lucy's approach to the job. I want to take this opportunity to thank you all for being here, for watching, for listening. I want to thank Sigourney and Jim for their wonderful words of support, to Jon Landau, who undertook the role of interlocutor with such finesse and such aplomb. I want to thank the event committee who rallied so many good friends and supporters. A special thank you to Dr. Charles Bennett and his team, to Catherine and Michael Kulsher, Joseph Corso, Julie Kim Einiger, Jack Mayberry, Brad Raymond, and Gus Schwed. You've all stepped up as leaders in this effort, and it is deeply appreciated. You know, so much depends on stepping up. And as the critically important January 11 first fundraising deadline approaches, I urge and I implore everyone watching and listening to step up tonight and make a donation that will help to firmly establish Lucy as a front runner to be reckoned with in what is a highly charged and competitive race. This race comes down to, what do we want? What do we have a right to expect in the person leading the preeminent prosecutor's office in the nation? And in my book, it boils down to leadership. A true leader displays integrity, intelligence, and independence in thought and action. A true leader knows how to collaborate, how to delegate, and how to inspire. A true leader manifests compassion, empathy, experience, and reason in matters of policy. A true leader has an appreciation and an understanding of history, with both feet planted firmly in the present and a vision for the future. And a true and a confident leader listens. And that is who Lucy is. Supporting her candidacy is an investment in our community, an investment in the safety, equity, and dignity of all New Yorkers. And furthermore, the vote in New York sets an example for the rest of the nation. So, giving in the early stages of the campaign, especially when there are so many candidates from one party, is particularly crucial. So, folks, if you're thinking of giving $100, why not give 200? Or if you're considering giving 1,000, why not make it a deuce? By the way, I should tell you that the maximum allowable donation is $36,105.25. But if you just want to give the 36K, I promise I'll find a legal way to make up the $105.25. On the other hand, if you want to hold on to the 36K and give the $105.25, we'll be happy to take that as well. Or maybe you should just split the difference. That would be $18,052.75. And as my father used to say, it only hurts for a minute. Of course, there are other ways to support Lucy as well. Please spread the word far and wide about Lucy's candidacy. Please consider hosting or co-hosting an event similar to this one tonight. You know, in our current virtual lives, we in the campaign will give you all the guidance and support you need. Or how about you just send an email, a tweet, a Facebook post voicing your support for Lucy. Now, my support is undeniably rooted in a father's fierce love. But it's also based on my unshakable faith in Lucy Lang's ability to get the job done, to lead a system of justice that will be a shining model for the rest of the country and the world. New York deserves no less. Thank you all, and may the new year, which incidentally this year begins January 21st, bring health and peace to us all. Good night, and I think Sigourney is going to sing us out.
You know, if my on-screen characters have taught me anything, is that we really need to have more women in power. And I know that Lucy is the right woman for this job. So I hope you'll join me in showing her your support tonight. Good luck, Lucy. I'm with you 100%.